I've never been one to believe in the supernatural or the paranormal. I always thought people who claim to experience such things were either imagining it or just looking for attention. But after what happened to me at that movie theater, I'm not so sure anymore. It was a typical Friday night. My friends and I had decided to catch a late-night showing of a new horror movie that had been getting some buzz. We were all excited, mostly to make fun of the scares, the typical group of friends watching a cheesy horror flick. The theater was pretty empty. It was the last show of the night, and most people were already heading home. So we had the place almost to ourselves. We took our seats in the middle row, which is always the best spot, and settled in. I remember feeling oddly uneasy, but I chalked it up to the cold air conditioning in the empty, silent theater. It was just a strange feeling in the back of my mind, one I tried to ignore. The movie started, and we all laughed at the cheesy jump scares and ridiculous plot. It wasn't until about halfway through the film that things started getting weird. At first, it was small things. Flickering lights, a soft whispering noise I couldn't quite place. At first, I thought it was just the film's sound design, or maybe someone outside the theater. But then the whispering grew louder, and it was coming from inside the theater, around me. I glanced at my friends. They looked as confused and unsettled as I felt, but they didn't say anything. The whispers became more distinct, more urgent. It felt like they were coming from the rows behind us. I turned around quickly, expecting to see someone playing a prank, but the theater was still empty, except for us. That's when I noticed the figure. It wasn't immediately obvious. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light or my imagination, but as I squinted into the darkness, I saw it, a tall, shadowy figure standing in the aisle near the projection booth. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, watching us. I froze. My heart started pounding. I tried to brush it off, thinking I was just seeing things, but the figure didn't go away. It was like it was waiting for something. My mind raced, wondering if it was someone from the staff or even a prankster. But no one in the theater looked like that. No one should have been standing there. I whispered to my friends, trying to get their attention without drawing the figure's gaze. But they didn't seem to notice. Maybe they didn't see what I saw. I started to feel suffocated. The air felt heavier, colder, and the whispers were getting louder, more frantic. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was dozens, overlapping, speaking in a language I didn't understand. My palms were sweating, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I turned back to the screen, but the image was distorted. The colors were wrong. The edges of the frames were flickering, like the projector was malfunctioning. And then, something that still haunts me, the figure in the aisle moved. It didn't walk like a normal person. It was glitching. The body was jerking forward as though it was being dragged along by some invisible force. I felt like I was going to pass out right then and there. Suddenly, the lights went out. Total darkness. Panic hit me like a freight train. I heard my friends' voices, disoriented, calling out to each other, but I couldn't make sense of it. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on me, and the only thing I could hear were the whispering voices, now louder than ever. I reached for my phone, trying to use the flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. It was as if the whole theater had swallowed every bit of light and sound, leaving us in total, suffocating darkness. Then I saw it, right in front of me, blocking the aisle. The figure. It wasn't the same one anymore. It had changed. It was no longer a shadow. It was fully formed, its face twisted into something inhuman. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and glowing in the dark. The skin was stretched too tight over its bones, and its mouth was open wide as if it were trying to say something, but no sound came out. The whispers stopped. Everything stopped. It felt like time itself had frozen. And then, in that suffocating silence, it reached for me. I don't know how I managed to move, but I bolted from my seat, pushing past my friends and stumbling toward the exit. The lights flickered back on, but it didn't matter. The theater had changed. The aisles seemed to stretch on forever, and the exit door that I knew had been there was gone. It was as if the theater was rearranging itself, trapping us in some kind of nightmarish labyrinth. I finally made it to the door, yanked it open, and ran out into the parking lot, my heart hammering in my chest. I don't know how I got home that night. I just remember feeling like I had narrowly escaped something that would have pulled me into its dark grip if I hadn't run. When I tried to tell my friends what happened, they didn't believe me. They said I must have imagined it, that I had been scared by the movie. But I know what I saw. I can still hear the whispers when I close my eyes, and I can still see that figure, standing in the aisle, waiting for me. I was always a fan of old horror films, the classics, the ones where the tension built slowly and the scares weren't cheap but psychological. I used to frequent this small, independent movie theater downtown that specialized in screening old films. It had an eerie charm to it, creaky floors, a musty smell, and dim lighting that made everything seem like it was stuck in time. One evening, I decided to go see a late-night showing of an old black and white movie that had been long out of circulation. I'd seen it advertised online for a special screening, and since it was on my bucket list to see in the theater, I figured it would be the perfect opportunity. I'd been to this theater a few times before, so I knew what to expect. Small, intimate, and a little rundown, but with a lot of character. I arrived around 11 p.m., just as the last few people were heading inside. The ticket booth was closed, but there was a note on the door directing people to the side entrance. When I entered, I was greeted by the usual smell of stale popcorn and dust. The lobby was small, with just a few posters on the walls, all advertising upcoming screenings of classic horror films. It looked like it hadn't changed in decades. The usher, an older man with a thick mustache and worn-out clothes, directed me to the screening room and handed me a ticket with the words Screening Room 3 written on it. He didn't say much else, just gave me a nod before turning back to the lobby. I walked into the theater and immediately noticed something strange. The room was almost completely empty, save for a few other scattered people who had already taken their seats. That wasn't too unusual, though, considering the time of night. The screen was already on, and the film had just begun. I sat down in the middle row, right in the center, where I always preferred to sit. The lights dimmed, and I settled in, excited to finally watch this classic on the big screen. At first, everything seemed normal. The film was just starting, the black and white images flickering to life. The sound was slightly muffled, but I figured it was just the old projector they use. Then, things started to feel off. At first, it was just a strange sensation in the back of my mind, a feeling that someone was watching me. I kept glancing around, but the few people in the theater were just absorbed in the movie, no one paying attention to me. It was almost too quiet, too still. And the more I watched, the more I felt like the atmosphere in the room was shifting. The air felt heavier, like there was something pressing down on me. And then I saw it. On the screen, there was a scene where a woman entered a dark room, her face filled with dread. But as the scene unfolded, I noticed something strange happening with the shadows on the screen. They started moving, shifting unnaturally, as if they weren't part of the film at all. It was subtle at first, but soon it became more pronounced. The shadows seemed to crawl and stretch, creeping out of the edges of the screen and toward the audience. My breath caught in my throat. I looked around the room, but everyone else seemed completely oblivious, still staring at the screen, completely absorbed in the film. I shifted in my seat, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling in my chest. I was imagining things. The film was old. Maybe the projector was malfunctioning. But then the shadows started to move more aggressively. I blinked and suddenly I wasn't in the theater anymore. The shadows had consumed the entire screen, and the walls around me seemed to blur, warping as if the room itself was being distorted. It wasn't just on the screen anymore. It was all around me, creeping toward my seat. I could feel the coldness of it on my skin, the chill creeping up my spine, and then a whisper. "Get out." I froze, my heart thundering in my chest. I turned my head quickly, but no one seemed to hear it. No one else was reacting, as if they couldn't hear the voice at all. It was like I was the only one aware of what was happening. Then the room darkened even further, the screen now completely black. The only light was from a single flickering bulb overhead, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. I stood up, feeling an overwhelming urge to leave, but my body wouldn't move. It was like I was paralyzed, trapped in the chair, unable to break free from the suffocating atmosphere. I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps moving down the aisle behind me. My eyes darted around, but no one was there. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I screamed, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, like something was choking me. The hand on my shoulder squeezed, and I finally broke free from my paralysis. I shot up from my seat, heart racing, and turned to run. But as I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The rows of seats were filled with people. Not people who were watching the movie, but figures, shadowy, distorted versions of people. Their faces twisted in grotesque expressions. They were all staring at me. "Get out," the voice whispered again, louder this time, like it was coming from every direction. "Leave now, before it's too late." I didn't need to hear anything more. I bolted for the exit, my legs shaking beneath me. The door was just ahead, but as I ran toward it, it slammed shut on its own, trapping me inside. I screamed, desperately trying to pull the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The lights flickered and the room felt colder. The shadows were closing in around me, creeping down the walls like a thick, oily mist. I don't know how long I was there. All I remember is that the shadows were getting closer, suffocating the room with their presence. The last thing I saw before everything went black was one of the distorted figures rising from the seat in front of me, its mouth stretched wide into a horrific grin. When I woke up, I was back in the lobby, the theater empty. It was as if nothing had happened, like the entire event had been a bad dream. I looked around, still shaking, but the usher was there, just like before, smiling as if nothing was wrong. "I hope you enjoyed the film," he said, his voice too calm, too casual. "It's one of our most popular showings." I didn't say anything. I just ran out of the theater, never looking back. I never went back there again, and I don't think I ever will. I don't know if I've ever been truly scared in my life, at least not until that night. The night I met the phantom projectionist. I've always had a passion for movies. Growing up, I spent most of my free time in theaters, even working a part-time job at a small old movie house during my college years. It wasn't anything glamorous, but I loved the atmosphere. It had that old-school charm with faded velvet seats, peeling posters of movies from the 50s and 60s, and the smell of buttered popcorn that made it feel like stepping back in time. The theater I worked at was one of those places that had a loyal, almost cult-like following. People would come from miles around just to watch movies that weren't available anywhere else. But there was something about the place, the history behind it, that always unsettled me. It wasn't until I started working there late nights that I began to understand why. It was a Tuesday night when the incident happened. The theater was closing for the evening, and I was doing my usual shift, preparing everything for the next day's shows. The last movie had ended, and I had already cleaned up the auditorium. The lobby was quiet, and I was about to shut down the projector room for the night when I heard a strange sound, like footsteps coming from the projection booth. I froze. I was sure I had already locked up the booth. There shouldn't have been anyone else in the building. I called out, but no one answered. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me, but I decided to check anyway. Maybe someone had stayed behind, trying to catch the end of a movie or grab something they'd forgotten. As I climbed the narrow stairs to the projection room, I could feel an odd chill in the air, even though the building was always warm. The hallway leading to the booth was dark, lit only by a single flickering light. I reached the door and knocked, but no one answered. The door creaked open on its own. I stepped inside and immediately felt a sense of unease. The projector was still running, but the film was all twisted and warped. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. The reels were spinning wildly, but the film on the screen was nothing but distorted shapes and flickers of light. And then I saw him. He was standing there by the projector, his back to me. He wore an old-fashioned suit, dark and formal, almost like something from the 1920s. His hair was neatly combed, and he was completely still, staring at the screen as if it was the most fascinating thing in the world. His face was pale, almost sickly, and there was something unsettling about the way he held himself. Rigid, like he wasn't really there at all. "Hey," I called, my voice sounding much smaller than I intended. "Are you okay?" The man didn't respond. I took a few cautious steps closer, my heart racing. Something about him felt wrong, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't. I reached out to touch his shoulder, but just before I did, he turned his head. His eyes were completely black. No whites, no pupils, just dark voids staring into me. I froze, unable to move. He smiled, a thin, almost cruel smile that didn't reach his eyes. And then his mouth opened. But instead of speaking, he emitted a low, guttural growl, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest like it was coming from deep inside him, not from his mouth at all. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. The man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned back to the projector, his hands reaching out as if to adjust the reels, even though they were already running fine. And then, as if he was completely oblivious to my presence, he whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, though his voice sounded distorted, like it was coming from a long distance. "It's not over." Before I could react, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, panicked, trying to get out, but it was as if the room had changed. The walls felt closer, and the ceiling seemed to lower, suffocating me with its heavy presence. The lights flickered again, and the image on the screen became even more twisted. The shapes on the screen were now moving, writhing like they were alive. And then I saw it. A figure, a shadow, moving in the film, but this time it was coming closer, closer to the edge of the screen, as if it was reaching out, stretching toward me. I screamed, scrambling for the door, but it wouldn't open. I could hear the man's laugh, low and eerie, growing louder with every passing second. It was as if the sound was coming from all around me, inside my head, inside the very walls of the room. The shadows on the screen were now spilling out into the room, crawling along the floor, the walls as if they were no longer confined to the screen. In a blind panic, I forced myself to push against the door, my hand trembling as I twisted the knob. Finally, the door swung open, and I was thrown out into the hallway, gasping for air, feeling like I had narrowly escaped something I couldn't understand. The moment I stepped out of the projection room, the building went completely silent. The film had stopped playing, the projector had turned off, and the lights returned to normal. The strange atmosphere that had been so suffocating was gone. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. How could I? No one would believe me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the projection room hadn't been real, not in the way we think of people as real. He was something else, something that had been trapped in that place for far too long. And every time I pass by that theater now, I wonder if he's still there, watching the films, waiting for someone to come into his domain again.